Please be seated. It is a hallmark of a good coming-of-age story that the protagonist goes from a time of innocence, a time of childhood, into a time of new awareness. Something happens, or maybe a series of events happen in which that person has discovered what was either previously off limits or previously unknown, and comes into a new experience, usually with a kind of heightened sense of emotion, oftentimes of joy or of ecstasy. Sometimes in a coming-of-age story, it comes also with tragedy that represents innocence lost. And in these two passages of Scripture that we have heard this morning, we have two coming-of-age stories. We have two narratives in which there is a movement from a time in which things were simpler to a time in which things get more complex. And the responses of the protagonists in each one are of great consequence. And so we're going to reflect as we hear about the movements of Adam and Eve and the movement of Jesus, about our own movements in relationship with God. There was a time in your life in which you were told that loving God and God loving you would be like things would be okay, always and forever. And children's Sunday school songs, well-meaning but age-appropriate, tend to reflect this theme that comes across somewhat like, now that I've found Jesus, I'll be happy all the time. But hopefully there was a point in your life in which you realize that being a person of faith does not mean that God makes things happy all the time. And hopefully along with that movement, that maturing into a greater realization of what it means to be a Christian, you are not turned off by disappointment or complexity, but instead sense the opportunity to go deeper. And that's what happens in these two narratives. And so you have heard before the narrative from Genesis, the allegory of two first humans being in this paradise, this place in which all was provided for them, in which every need was taken care of, in which they didn't have a worry in the world. And then there comes into the story a temptation that is really not about a snake and not about an apple, but about a choice of awareness. How much do I want to know? And what would it be like to know the things that God knows? It's a coming-of-age story. It's the choice that's made of, I want to be like the one who is all-knowing and all-powerful. And when you make that choice, as was made in this allegory, you do, in fact, get to know a great many more things and experience a great many more things than you knew before. A great many things about the depths of love and about the opportunity for blessing in abundance, and a great many things about disappointment and the pain that comes with destruction in the world. And so that is a coming-of-age experience. A time in which innocence is lost and the things that were prior unknown become known. And for most of us, it is something that we don't get a choice of. We are exposed to something, whether we choose it or not, that makes us think, wow, life is more complex than I used to know. And so in a way, the story of Genesis, the so-called fall from grace of Adam and Eve, was inevitable because it is the progression that all human beings must make. whether we would want to know some of the things that we come to know in greater maturity or not, we need to. And the reality is then, God is still there with us, walking beside us through those things that are more complex. The great aftermath of their fall from the garden was that God's love persisted. An alternative ending to the story could have been, you did what I told you not to do, and therefore I will hide my face from you forever. Sometimes consequences in life come with that either-or kind of dichotomy. But in this story, the love of God persists through the emerging from innocence into greater knowledge. And so we give thanks for this coming of age story, because it reassures us that as we seek to pursue things in our own life, that God will be there with us. The second story in the gospel narrative, there are things of great consequence that are put before Jesus, but there's also an element of humorous banter to it as well. There's this sparring match that comes right at the beginning of Jesus' emergence from a time of simplicity. He goes on retreat. And if any of you have ever had the opportunity to go on retreat, it is usually a blessed experience. You get to put some stuff to the side. You get to suspend complexities of life and just get into this simple place, usually where things are provided for you more so than in ordinary life, and just bask. And Jesus did that in the wilderness, and then he comes out of it, it says, after this symbolic number, 40 days and 40 nights. That's what lays ahead of us in the season of Lent, roughly 40 days. And he comes out of that, and he is confronted with these choices about who he's going to satisfy. In an overly simplistic summary of their choices about ego or faithfulness. And so Satan, or the Satan, the power in the world that would oppose the presence of God, gives him these options. You have God's power within you. You can do magic tricks. He doesn't say it like that, but he says, turn these stones into bread. And if the things that we say about God are true, then that would have been a piece of cake. If God is one who is capable of the power of resurrection, then how simple would it be in order to change an element into something else in order to satisfy an immediate need? You're hungry? No problem. You don't need Uber Eats. There's a rock. You got it. And Jesus says, that's not what the power's for. And he's taken up onto this high place, and he's told that if God's love is really unconditional for him, if he's really the golden child sent into the world, then no harm could possibly happen to him. And those of us who know the rest of the story know that that's not how it worked out. Harm did happen to him. But it wasn't because of God's abandonment. It was because of human sinfulness. And so there's this choice. Am I going to make God prove God's love to me? Or am I already secure in that? And I'm on to better and more important things. The last temptation is probably the one that most poignantly speaks to our own time, which is the one in which an individual can have great power and influence over others. I will give you all these kingdoms of the world. And Jesus says, I already got it. What you're offering is a fraud. This is not what I came for. And yet these questions that were put to him were really, really important. Imagine what happens In the rest of the story, imagine your relationship with this person named Christ if the answer to any one of those questions had been, oh yeah, that sounds good. I'm going to do that. What does that do to the stature of the Messiah, the one called the Son of God? And so there was this coming of age for Jesus, not childhood, biological age, but spiritual maturity age, in which he is affirming, this is who I am. This is why I'm here. This is what I have been sent to do. These stories have connections to your life of faith and to mine. We have come over the course of our lives to the place in which we are today, and most of the time, the choices have been pretty inconsequential. Usually, as I was talking about last week, the experiences that we have in our daily lives are pretty ordinary. They're not dramatic. But every once in a while, there comes choices, forks in the road, in which the way in which we go determines a great deal. And that is true not only for when we start a family or how we progress in our careers or the decision that we make in an important relationship, but it's also true in the ways in which we navigate our relationship with God. Do we go in the direction towards intimacy with the Holy One? Or do we go in any of the other myriad number of directions that are constantly available to us saying, pick me, pick me, pick me. You don't need God. God's not important. God's not going to do anything for your retirement plan. You don't need that. And these choices are constantly before us. And so each time that we make one of those choices, we emerge a little bit more in the context of all that the world has to offer us and has to seduce us with and has to give us good things with. We emerge a little bit more into the complexity of the opportunity for a mature faith. We come of age, not a biological age, but of a spiritual age and maturity. And so Lent is one of these great opportunities throughout the year to step back and to reflect and to say, am I where I want to be at this present time in my life and in the opportunities that are available to me? Am I going in the way that I want to be going in my connection with God? Am I experiencing the maturity that I want to be experiencing? And some people do that gradually. Some people do that slowly, step by step, and other people do it when they end up in crisis. When there's a diagnosis of a terminal illness or when something happens that shakes one's foundation to the core and they ask themselves the question, God, do you really love me? Because I think that was just a test and I don't know if you're there. And we find ourselves in the same place as Jesus was at the end of his retreat. Maybe going this way and maybe going that way. And these are coming of age experiences. And so my prayer for each and every one of us this Lent is that we use this time well. That we don't let it fade into the background and days pass uneventful or unreflected upon, but that we take on some intentional way of pursuing our connection with God during this 40-day period. Because it is from making those kind of intentional choices that greater maturity emerges. It doesn't happen by accident. And it doesn't happen by happenstance that we come to know who we are and why we are in this world and what it is that God has blessed us to be able to do. So may you follow in the footsteps of Adam and Eve. May you follow in the footsteps of Jesus, who emerged from poignant experiences into that greater depth of the knowledge of God and the conviction of God's love for you and of your capacity to be a vessel for God's love to others in the world. If we use this season of Lent for that purpose, we will become people who are strong indeed in faith, both for our own peace which passes understanding, but also for our capacity to navigate whatever life may bring to us, solid and unshaken in the knowledge that God's love is unconditional, that God will be with us now and forever, and that because we have the privilege of being those people in that relationship, that nothing can shake us. Amen.